if I ever leave this world alive. Well, thank you for the things you did in my life.
Morning, friends. YouTube pipers, cigar smokers, random people who like to watch my videos. I hope the day has greeted you well. Thank you, Nomad Piper. Loving this Boswell. I don't know why you didn't like it. Though based on what I've seen of your collection, I could see it's kind of not really your style, but it smokes well. Oh, really beginning to love this blend. Very good stuff. Very good. So, this is sort of a video response to a comment I had in one of my previous videos by Public Piper. Who, by the way, if you've not subbed Public Piper yet, you need to go out, pause this video, open another window, go find him and sub him now. He has got some of the coolest videos out there right now. His whole niche is going out smoking in pipes in public and then talking about those experiences. Just fantastic. Great content. So, a couple of weeks ago, he was watching one of my videos and he commented, he said, "Hey, I'm curious about your thoughts on Plato and a book that Plato wrote called Meno." Plato. Meno. Right? I said, it's so funny you had asked me that, because when he had posted that comment, myself and Nomad Piper Damon were in a huge email back and forth discussion about this very topic, and I was sort of telling him my interpretation of it, and Damon countered with his interpretation of it, and in true wisdom junkie form, I'm just as confused about it as I was when I started. But Damon has some pretty good points. So, what is this book about? I'm not a philosophy professor. I never had this stuff taught to me. I just read the damn book and I got out of it what I got out of it. And basically, Socrates is having a conversation with a guy named Meno. And the question at hand is, they're trying to define what virtue is. And Meno asks, "Can you tell me, Socrates, whether virtue is acquired by teaching or by practice? If neither by teaching or by practice, then whether it comes to man by nature or in some other way." So the question is about virtue and how virtue is acquired. Socrates, being who he is, asks the question, well, what is virtue? And Socrates is kind of an asshole this way. He just, he goes and he asks all these questions of people and drives them literally insane. And he's called very wise, but at the end of the day, he's like, all I know is I know nothing. And I don't know anything more than you do. But if you can tell me what virtue is, then great. He quotes, he says, "I literally do not know what virtue is." So he turns it around on Meno to ask him, okay, well, before I can tell you where virtue comes from, what is virtue? So Meno starts to go in and he's like, well, take the virtue of man. His virtue is to know how to administer the state, in the administration of which he will benefit his friends and damage his enemies. A woman's virtue may also be easily described. Her virtue is to order her house and obey her husband. Woo! You can tell this is ancient text. the conversation continues. Meno's like, well, virtue is also strength, and whether of a man or a woman, it's the same. He goes on and on and on about trying to figure out whether virtue is found in temperance, whether it's found in justice, and courage, and wisdom, and magnificence. These are all virtues. Various virtues, but he can't really define even what virtue is. Can you? Can you guys tell me what virtue is without going to a dictionary? So, once I figure all that out, God, I'm really starting to get into this 965. You guys are right, man. It's good. Anyway. Meno ended up saying, like, okay, Socrates, look, virtue, as I take it, is love and attainment of the honorable. Love and attainment of the honorable. So, we kind of get a loose definition, coming from Meno about even what virtue is. So, that morphs into virtue would appear to be the power of attaining good. If you are a virtuous person, you have a power of attaining good. And then you have to go into what is good, and that's like a whole mind-blowing thing in and of itself. So, they go back and forth. And he keeps asking, Socrates keeps asking more and more questions about what is virtue, what is virtue. They never really get anywhere. But then that conversation morphs into, okay, even though we have a loose definition of virtue, where does this virtue come from? Where does courage come from? Where does the honorable attainment of good come from? So then Socrates asserts, he makes the assertion that all learning is but recollection. Again, all learning is but recollection. So when you learn something, you're recalling previous information. What does that even mean, right? He says to Meno, call me one of your attendants. So Meno brings one of his slaves over who's very uneducated. He knows very little. He goes, let me demonstrate on him. He says, attend now to the questions which I ask him, and observe whether he learns of me or only remembers. And he starts in on this like geometrical sort of problem. It ends up looking like this. Okay. And he goes, tell me, boy, do you know that a figure like this is a square? I do. And you know that a square figure has 4 lines, equal? Certainly. And these lines which I have drawn through the middle of the square are also equal. Yes, a square may be of many sides, yes. And he goes on and on and on and on and on, ultimately getting to the slave boy to determine certain, what the answer to the problem was in geometry. I'm not going to go into the problem. The point is, at the end of this line of questioning, Socrates says, look, I never taught him anything. I've only asked him questions. I only asked him questions. The information he got from somewhere. Somehow, naturally, he came to the logical conclusion of the answer that he was looking for. So, Socrates says, were not these answers given out of his own head? Simply by asking questions. He says, yes, they were all his own. Socrates says, and yet, as we were just now saying, he did not know how to do these mathematically geometrical problems. Meno says, true. And yet he had those notions about him. Yes. Then he who does not know still has true notions of that which he does not know. Wrap your brain around that one. Meno says, yes. And at present, these notions are just wakening in him. That's key. As in a dream. But if were frequently asked the same questions in different forms, he would know as well as anyone at last. Meno says, yeah. Without anyone teaching him, he will recover his knowledge for himself. If he is only asked questions. Meno says, yes. In this spontaneous recovery in him recollection, true, and this knowledge which he now has must he not either have acquired or always possessed? Meno says, yes. But if he always possessed the knowledge, he would always have known, or if he had acquired the knowledge, he could have not acquired it in this life unless he had been taught geometry. For he may be made to do the same with all geometry and every other branch of knowledge. Now, has anyone ever taught him? You must know that if, as you say, he was born and bred in your house. Meno says, no, I never taught him anything. And yet he has the knowledge. Most certainly. Socrates, well, clearly he must have learned it at some other time. That is evident. And that must have been the time when he was not a man. He must have learned those things at a time when he was not a man. Socrates. And if the truth of all things always existed in the soul, then the soul is immortal. That's the question. I took 12 minutes to get to that point. I'm sorry. If you're still with me, the question asked of me of Public Piper was, what do I think of this idea that Socrates is bringing up? That I can ask you a whole line of questions on a subject you may know nothing about, and you might be able to come to the logical conclusion on your own without me actually teaching you anything, but that knowledge had to have come from somewhere, and that knowledge, even though it was not taught, has always existed somewhere. And he's saying it came from before you were a man through an immortal soul. The question then becomes, do we have a soul? Well, that is the question, isn't it? In my conversation with Damon, essentially, he says, well, no, not necessarily. Just because you can come to a logical conclusion of something using human reason doesn't mean, or is it proof of a soul, that knowledge existed always or before being a man. That the brain and just the way it works can apply reason just because we're lucky human beings with big brain to come to a determination about something that is logical. Interesting, huh? It's a lot to take in. So, Nomad Piper, very intelligent man, becoming a good friend of mine, he brought up the idea of a brain in a jar. You have a human brain alive. Let's say there's a science that now can keep a brain functioning alive in a jar. We suddenly live in a world where that can happen. Can it learn? Can it learn without sensory data? So, if you have a human brain in a jar, can it learn without sight, without hearing, without touch, without the rest of the body and the sensory, and the senses that the humans have to apply data to the brain for it to process and then understand and come to a conclusion? It seems that would not be the case. David says, look, we solve problems all the time without any type of a formal education, simply through logical deduction that the brain has the capacity to do because of the senses. It has nothing really to do with a priori knowledge, or knowledge that was somehow you had before you were a man and an immortal soul. We solve problems because the senses load our brain with information, and then the brain learns how to use it. Simple as that. And then our reasoning fits everything together. And David makes a good point. He says, look, I'd have been more impressed if Socrates had the same result in a 1-year-old child whose brain is not necessarily is fully developed, whose senses has not been exposed to as much life and experiment in things. And that's true. It makes a good point. Could a 1-year-old come up with the same logical conclusion? No, probably not. So, is it proof of an immortal soul? That is the question. Is virtue learned? Is virtue known always? Is it known instinctively? So then I counter with, okay, well, where does instinct come from? Okay, how do some animals know how to stand up and walk and immediately start suckling 2 seconds after they're born? How does a child know how to do this when she's born and then suckle at his mother's breast? Instinct. Where'd that knowledge come from? Is it biology? Is it just years of evolution? Or is it God? Is it an immortal soul? Was it Santa Claus? I don't have the answer. I just don't. But it sure is fun to think about these things. So, if you've lasted this long, come up with your own theory. Comment. Do we have prior knowledge? Do we have an immortal soul? Or do we not? I am a student, guys. I am not a teacher. At least come up with your own ideas and thoughts. Hypotheses. But at the end of the day, I don't think really anybody knows for certain anything. And Socrates' whole life came down to that. To try to prove to everyone around him that at the end of the day, all you really know is that you don't know anything at all. Thanks for watching, guys. Go sub Public Piper. Go sub Nomad Piper. Smoking Lamp is out.